All right, thanks everybody for sticking around till the very end today. So people typically think of evolution as a very, very slow process. And for many evolutionary phenomena, it is. New species don't form overnight. That takes millions of years. And likewise with major adaptations like the evolution of multicellularity, the evolution of flight, things like that. However, there are also many very rapid evolutionary changes that take place from generation to generation. These are just changes in the phenotypes or traits of organisms that are a product of selection and inheritance. So here are three very prominent and timely examples. So one are the Galapagos finches, which have been very well studied for the past 30 years. And there they've shown that in response to changes in the abundance of different types of seeds, that the beak morphology of the finches has evolved, which has had very major impacts on the population dynamics of the finches. Another example are Atlantic cod in the Northeast. And too many cod have gone from this to this, which has caused the fishery to collapse. And it's also induced evolutionary changes in size at various ages and age to maturation. And then another very important example is influenza and many other diseases. In the case of flu, we can see that different genotypes evolve over time and are responsible for outbreaks over time. So there's a turnover of the genetic type of the virus. So these examples of rapid evolution aren't confined to those three. And one place where there are also very many examples of rapid evolution are in invasive species. Here's just a sample of the papers that have been written on this topic. It kind of makes sense. You take a species from some exotic foreign land, put it somewhere new. It's got lots of different novel selection pressures that are acting on it. And in many cases, they're genetically based changes that happen over time. So one aspect of biological invasions that society and ecologists are very concerned about is spatial spread. So an invader gets introduced to a place, but its ultimate impact is really determined by how far and how fast it spreads. And typically we think of spread as a process of range expansion that occurs over decades, maybe even centuries, and over relatively large geographic scales. And the rate and dynamics of spread are really important to management. In this case down here on the bottom of gypsy moths, which have spread from the Northeast and now across the Midwest, these gypsy moths incur billions of dollars of damage on forests in these regions. And active management of the movement of this invasion front has actually saved lots and lots of money. And this has all required a very detailed understanding of how gypsy moths spread. So the basic determinants of spatial spread, we typically think of this just like any other reaction-diffusion process in chemistry or any other field. If we look at the spatial distribution of a population, we see that there's this very populated region, and then there's an invasion front that moves in this direction over time. And it's really a component of two processes. One are demographic increases or population growth, and the other is dispersal of those new individuals. Well, linking this back to the rapid evolution, it turns out that both demographic and dispersal traits are subject to evolution, and the effect that we might expect these to have on spatial spread is to increase it. So if there are adaptive increases in demography at the invasion front, we expect greater demographic increases and farther spread, likewise with more extensive dispersal. And of course, if both reproduction and dispersal are increasing at the invasion front, we might expect even more rapid spread. So this is just sort of a general phenomenological expectation. So what I set out to do was to quantify how strong an impact on spatial spread evolution can really have. We typically think of evolution as very slow and spatial spread as very fast. So can it really be important? Well, I'll briefly summarize the whole paper in this one slide. I took a very general model, a system of reaction-diffusion, PDES, did some numerical analyses and so forth, but I also came up with an analytical approximation for the wave speed, which is typically nothing new, but I also had evolution of reproductive traits thrown in there and expressed in this simple formula which takes advantage of commonly estimated parameters for population. So there's population growth rate and generation time. And if we look at how the increase in spread rate depends on heritability and the selection strength on the trait, in a number of species where there's been an observation of accelerating spread, we see that moderate heritabilities and realistic but strong selection can account for the increase in spread that we've seen in those species. So this really establishes that evolution can be strong enough to have impacts on the timescale of spatial spread. So now we know that evolution can be strong and fast enough to impact spread. But what about this contribution of demography and dispersal? Which one is more important? So what's the relative contribution of these two types of evolution? The approach I took to this was to model the spread dynamics of cane toads in Australia. And I'll go ahead and warn you, this is, if you're a little bit squeamish, you should look away for about 20 seconds. I'm going to introduce you to cane toads, which are pretty nasty little creatures. So maybe this is a little bit excessive, but I think it shows the it demonstrates to you some of the impacts that cane toads have, and namely that is that they eat everything that can fit into their mouths. So they're really a big threat to lots of wildlife in Australia where they've invaded. And not only do they eat everything, but when things eat them, they die because the cane toads have these poisonous glands on their back. So when wildlife or pets or even children attempt to eat cane toads, bad things happen. So they really are a big deal. And so cane toads were introduced to Australia in 1935, right around there, near the Great Barrier Reef. And they've since spread westward across the country. And these colors here show the spread rate at any point in time. So we see that the spread rate has accelerated from about 10 kilometers a year to nearly 60 kilometers a year in just about 70 years. And then the other key feature of cane toads, which is why I bothered to study them, is that there's evidence of evolution at the invasion front in both demographic and dispersal characters. So there's shorter duration in the tadpole stage and higher metamorph growth, which both increase reproduction and survival. And then there's also increased dispersal, which they established by, I don't know if you can see it, this cane toad has a little belt on it, and they can track its movement over a number of days. So between the accelerating spread and evolution at the invasion front, this has all the right ingredients for trying to tease apart the effects of demographic and dispersal evolution on spread. So here's a glimpse of the data. We have the distribution of these traits before and after spread. And again, we have all the data on spread as well. And just to give you an idea of the type of modeling approach that I used, it really required three major components. We had to have demography, dispersal, and then some form of evolution. So the demography is just a simple matrix population model with juveniles and adults. Luckily, someone had already developed a model like this, and I was just able to take it and build from it. And then with dispersal, kind of an interesting thing that we came up with is a way to account for variation in dispersal. Typically, biologists think of there being some dispersal kernel that shows the redistribution of organisms after they've dispersed. And it's typically assumed that all individuals follow the same stochastic process of movement. But what we did is we actually measured variation in individual toad movement and fit different kernels to different toads. And then we have a distribution of movement in different toads, which comes up with a much different looking population level dispersal kernel. And also, since there's variation in dispersal among individuals, that also provides for the opportunity for it to evolve. And then finally, so the evolution, we treated each of these three traits as a quantitative genetic trait, which is just the sum of phenotypic contributions from a very large number of genes. And typically when people do work like this with a quantitative trait, they just track changes in the mean of the trait. But for various reasons, I actually had to model the entire joint distribution of all the traits. So it went from being a sort of simple analytical model to a little bit more of a complex computational challenge. So just to show you some equations, prove that there is some math behind all this. There they are. We've got some demography, some evolution, and then each of these rows is a point in time distributed across space. So we're interested in the distribution of toads across space. I just looked at one spatial dimension. We assume that there's isotropic movement, so it extrapolates very well to a two-dimensional landscape. And the red shows where the cane toads are, and I just tracked a window of the population dynamics around the invasion front, because that's really all that matters for spread dynamics, is what's going on at the invasion front. All right, and then so how we analyzed this, what kind of experiment we did, is I took the initial conditions in 1935 of the phenotypes and where the toads were, and I ran the model under a few different scenarios where demographic or dispersal were evolvable or not, and then compared the model results to what we actually observed in 2006, looking at the change in distance spread between these different scenarios, as well as the change in the distribution of phenotypes. So here are the different phenotypes. On the left column, we have the tadpole duration, metamorph growth, and dispersal, and then the 4 different scenarios in the rows. The light gray is the fit to the data before spread, and the dark gray the fit to data after spread, and then the colored lines are the model results. And we see that the model actually does a pretty good job of fitting to the data on what the phenotype change is over time. And this is all done with very realistic estimates of the heritability, suggesting that this evolutionary process really is a very good explanation for these phenotype changes that we've seen in the past 72 years. And for the most part, these things evolved like we would expect based on these different scenarios. One interesting thing is that there's a difference when we evolved dispersal by itself, or both demography and dispersal. And the dispersal evolution was actually enhanced when there was demographic evolution going on, which is a pretty surprising result. We didn't expect this, and it helps us to interpret some of the spread dynamics, as I'll show you right now. So here's Australia. There's the range of cane toads at the present time. It's where they originated and where they ended up. And then these points show how far they've moved over time. And you can see that they started out pretty slow, but then sort of accelerated over time. Now, the base model with no evolution going on, we see a pretty slow rate of spread, much like what's going on at the beginning of the invasion. And it just proceeds at that constant rate, which is obviously much different than what's going on in the data. If we throw demographic evolution in there, you see we get a little bit of an increase in the rate of spread, which translates to a little bit farther predicted range of the toads, but obviously it still comes up short. If we only allow dispersal to evolve, we see a pretty similar pattern. It increases spread distance a little bit more, but not much. So if we put demography and dispersal evolution together, we might expect something like this dotted pink line here, that their contributions add up to increase spread a little bit more. But what we actually see is that there's this interactive effect where demography and dispersal evolution interact to increase spread even more than what we might expect. And while this still doesn't account for the observed dynamics of spread, it's a relatively simple model. It leaves out a lot of things. This actually wasn't fitted to these data, so we don't expect it to necessarily overlap just right. But what this does show is the relative contribution of demographic and dispersal evolution, and how there's this interaction between the two that can affect the dynamics of spread. So to conclude, phenotype change, we see that evolution can account for the phenotype changes observed over the course of spatial spread. We see that evolution can account for much of the increases in spread rate that we observe in nature. This is a hypothesis that hasn't really been considered much until the past couple of years. And then whether dispersal or life history evolution is more important, dispersal is a little bit more of an impact, but they're both can have a pretty substantial contribution to spread. And then finally, there's this interaction between the two which is a pretty neat feature. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, thank my advisor and my committee, some other people I'd worked with, and then of course Krell and the DOE for funding me for the past few years. It's been a great time, and I appreciate it very much.